if you want to change the river into something you want today, look at what people did in the past to get what they wanted. Look at their movements, look at their tenacity, look at their passion. And I also incorporated a piece in that book then on the environment and the creation of the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. In chapter 7 of the book is really about the refuge creation. But that's another movement where someone said, we can have a different vision for this river, a different purpose, one for fish and wildlife and recreation. And Will Delg and the Isaac Walton League did that 100 years ago this year. And so, again, it showed that it's not just navigation, but you can take a whole different perspective and push for it and make it happen.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river, and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 52 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. Historian John Anfinson has spent much of his adult life working in jobs that have kept him close to the Mississippi River, first with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and then later with the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which is part of the National Park Service. So I thought it'd be fun to have him on this episode and have a wide-ranging discussion about his career as a river historian. During his tenure with the Corps of Engineers, for example, he learned about the work of Henry Bosse, whose photographs and maps documented the Mississippi before the lock and dam system was constructed. So we have a nice lengthy discussion about Bosse and his photographs. We also discussed some of the early history of the lock and dam system, including a brief overview of the forces that propelled those projects forward. After that, we kind of transitioned into a discussion about the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, like specifically how that got started. Turns out the history of that recreation area went back much further than I was aware of. Some of the challenges that John faced during his years with that recreation area, including the years he served as superintendent, which include things like just letting people know that the recreation area exists. And we finished with a few thoughts about the future of the river, some of the short-term challenges facing the river, and our hopes that more people will get involved to shape the river's future. And we talk about one project in particular that John is hopeful about, one that could reshape part of the Mississippi, particularly that stretch through the Twin Cities, and it could have ramifications downriver from there. So stick around, it's a fun interview. I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks to all of you who show me some love through Patreon. You can join the Patreon community for as little as $1 a month. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. You can join there. And joining even for that $1 a month level will get you early access to the podcasts. Patreon's not your thing? Well, buy me a coffee. I do have a caffeine habit, and I would appreciate your help sustaining it. If you want to know how to do that, just go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast and you will find instructions about how to buy me a coffee. At that same address, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, you'll also find the back episodes, all 51 previous episodes. Click on one of those episodes to listen and to read the show notes from each of those, as well as the show notes from this episode. Thank you for listening, and now let's get on with the interview. Dr. John Anfinson has been researching, writing, and speaking about the Upper Mississippi River for over 30 years. He spent the first half of his federal career with the St. Paul District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as a historian and cultural resources program manager. He joined the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, a unit of the National Park Service, in 2000, where he served as superintendent from 2014 to 2020. John is also the author of The River We Have Wrought, A History of the Upper Mississippi, and River of History. John holds a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Minnesota. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thanks for having me.
You know, John, I'm looking over your long career with the Mississippi, and it always makes me wonder, makes me curious about people's backgrounds and where they grew up. So, tell me a little bit about where you grew up and if the outdoors played any role in your life when you were a child.
I grew up in a small town of about 3,200 people in western Minnesota called Benson. And it was a typical small agricultural community. But my outdoor experience really came from our cabin up at Lake Minnewaska, about 25 miles north. One of the biggest, well, one of the top 20 lakes in the state in terms of size. And my family had an area where there were about three cabins, but it was all family. And it was large woods on either side. So we would go up there every summer and spend a lot of time there. And I just run around the woods, and my brothers and I and cousins, and we just loved getting up there and then swimming in the lake and fishing. And so nature was just embedded in my growing up.
Absolutely. That sounds fun to me. So those were summers, obviously, then, because you wouldn't go up there in the wintertime too much, I imagine.
Oh, we went up ice fishing a few times, which taught me never to get into ice fishing, but we didn't have
So
one of those fancy new fish houses that people have.
yeah. Did your family have any hunting traditions or fishing traditions besides going up north or
No, I went hunting a number of times. My dad was not a great hunter. One of my uncles would always hang ducks on our fence in the back just to kind of taunt my dad because my dad would rarely get ducks and he always got them.
so what was the first like miss how did you get connected to the Mississippi then? Let's go there. Like what did you know about the Mississippi growing up? What did you get first when was your first direct experience with the river that you can recall?
So my grandmother was from Brainerd, Minnesota, north of the Twin Cities. And she lived in this house close to the Mississippi, and you just cut through two houses and you could go down to the river. And of course, the mantra was, don't you kids dare go near the Mississippi River. So my first experience with the Mississippi was not to go near it. So that was my growing up experience. And then I went down from Benson to the University of Minnesota to go to college. And the main campus spans the Mississippi River. So you're going back and forth between the east and west banks. And I go back and forth hundreds of times. And I was amazed that the river never changed its height much. I didn't understand locks and dams at that time, that there was a lock and dam one downstream that was and I was walking over a reservoir the whole time. So that didn't sink in at first.
Right. What's interesting, so many people, so many of us, like our first impression of the Mississippi is like adults are telling us don't go anywhere there. There's a sense of danger and we should be afraid of the river. And it sounds like that was definitely the message you were given.
Yeah, it's interesting that I was warned not to go to the river, but we always went swimming in the lake. So rivers just had that different, they could carry you away, maybe physically as well as mentally.
Right. At that time at the University of Minnesota, was there much like was there a culture of Mississippi River recreation at all at the university or anything like that?
Not at all that I was aware of. It was, however, I mean, it was 1972. The environmental movement is in full swing, and there is a tremendous interest in, you know, the environment and protecting the environment. But I
Hmm.
just, I was a freshman, sophomore, junior. I was not connected into all those yet.
Right. So was your education continuous? Did you go right from undergrad to grad school?
Right. I went from my undergrad to my master's and then my doctorate.
And did you have a specialty or a niche within the history world or?
I had a double undergrad degree in anthropology, archaeology, and then history as well. Then my master's and doctorate were in American Indian history.
Wow. Uh, that must have been an interesting time to be researching that because that was also around the time you had the American Indian movement kind of growing in the Twin Cities area. And a greater consciousness of trying to to write our history or rewrite our histories of American Indian history to be more faithful to what really happened?
It's interesting that that never bled into the academia world that I was in. And I was studying with, indigenous scholars, but I didn't, we really didn't talk about that a lot. We did some.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be much more infused in over there today.
Right. Right. We'll get to that too, but I imagine it became a more important part of your work when you were with the Park Service as well, connecting with those. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. So when did you start working for the Corps then?
Early in my master's program, there was a position for an archaeologist, student trainee at the Corps. And so I applied for it, and I knew so little about the Corps that I spelled it CORE on the envelope I sent them. So, uh, and they hired me anyway. So I got hired as a student trainee, but as an archaeologist. They didn't hire historians at that point.
All right. So what were your responsibilities as a student archaeologist?
They threw me in pretty quick, and I remember them sitting me down right away with the federal regulations for cultural resource management. Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, and under that act, federal agencies had to take into account the impacts of their work on the cultural environment. So my job was to review core projects for their impact on historic and archaeological sites. For example, there's a big flood control project at Portage, Wisconsin, and the levee they were proposing was going to cross the mouth of the Portage Canal, which was on the National Register of Historic Places. And they're also going to build this long levee, and we had to decide, it's going to destroy some archaeological sites in the area. So that was one of my bigger projects I worked on early on in my career with the Corps.
So would the reports that you write influence the construction of those projects? And would they then have to find ways to minimize damage to those cultural heritage sites, or just say, oops, sorry, let's document as much as we can, but we have to build it this way? How did that generally work?
You've captured part of it. There's a triage. Number one is, can you avoid it? Can you avoid the damage? Number two is, can you minimize it? Do it in some way that's not going to destroy it completely. And third is, if you can't do either of those other two, how do you mitigate the damage? And for the Portage Canal, they had to build the levee across the mouth of the canal. And so we did a publication on it that told people about the history of the canal, and that was the mitigation.
All right. Well, you must have done something right because you ended up getting hired, permanently at some point, right? So, when did you become the historian and work with the cultural resources?
I'm not sure the exact date, but I just they kept pushing me to go permanent, and I said I'm not going to go permanent until I finish my PhD because I knew if I went permanent, I'd never finish it. I finished that in 1987 because I was working half-time for the Corps all through my master's and doctoral program. So it took a little longer than I wanted it to, but I was working half-time. So about 1987, 88, I went permanent with the Corps of Engineers. And it would take about 5 more years to convince them that they already had 4 other archaeologists on staff, that maybe we could change my title to historian, and they'd actually have a historian. There were 72 archaeologists nationwide in the Corps at that time, and I think 4 or 5 historians.
Wow. So when you were imagining that role of historian, then what did you picture what kind of projects or work did you imagine you would be doing for the Corps as the historian?
Well, it wasn't about what I imagined, it was about what they told me to do. So one of the bigger projects I worked on was the major maintenance, major rehab program for the locks and dams of the St. Paul district, locks and dams 3 through 26. And they were going to upgrade them. They're going to build all new central control stations on them. And so my job was to find out, first of all, do these locks and dams merit inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places? And if they do, at what level, local, regional, national? And so I started looking at the history of the locks and dams that were built during the 1930s. And I made an argument that they were nationally significant, that this was about connect to the whole system 3 through 26 of making the upper Mississippi River into a navigable highway for the nation. And the design and the engineering were really unique. And so I proposed that they be eligible for the National Register, which did not go over big with some people within the Corps. But the State Historic Preservation Office of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa agreed, and they became eligible. And eligible is being the same as being listed. You have to follow the National Historic Preservation Act if they are. So I got to help work with the architects on the design of the new buildings so that we could make sure they fit the historic character of the communities they were in or the historic character of the locks and dams themselves. So I got to influence design and as well as history.
Wow, interesting. So yeah, I remember like there was a period of time when there was a major every year they'd take on two or three locks to overhaul with major rehabilitation projects. It must have gone on for 20 years or something to get through all of them. Or
Yeah, it took a long time,
yeah,
which was good because I had to work on, helping on the design of each of those control stations. And each one of the locks and dams used to have a lockmaster's house and an assistant lockmaster's house. They lived on site. And they were removing all of those too because they thought that the lockmaster should just rent a place or buy a house in the towns they lived in. So we worked with Guttenberg, Iowa, to save the last lockmaster's house and work with the city to take it over as kind of a museum for the city. So if you go to Lock and Dam 10, the house is still there on site.
yeah. I think that museum is open seasonally, if I remember right. I've been there a couple of times, and it's a pretty decent living quarters if you're the lockmaster, and you can't beat the commute from there.
No, you can. When it first opened we had an exhibit there of these Henry Bosse photos of the Mississippi River. And people just came to see the Bosse photos in part, but it was also their first chance to come and see the house. They had never been able to get in and see what the house looked like. So there was quite a good crowd there when we opened it up.
So at Guttenberg, would there have also been a separate house for the assistant lockmaster?
There was, and that was taken away, moved
All right.
somewhere, you expect.
Hmm. The Corps has been involved with the river for so long. It's probably unimaginable to be the amount of materials and resources and information they must have accumulated over time. When you were working for the Corps as the historian, you must have had access to these incredible archives, this incredible history of the river.
When I was working on that Portage, Wisconsin project on the Wisconsin River, I was looking through the Wisconsin maps drawer and map files, and I came across a set of a dozen hand ink and watercolored poster-sized maps of the Wisconsin River from Portage to the mouth of the Wisconsin River, signed by General Warren, Gouverneur K. Warren, the hero of the Battle of Little Round Top at Gettysburg and the first district engineer for St. Paul. And it was just in the drawer. They're beautifully hand ink and watercolored maps in with the everyday maps. And because I found stuff like that, I started creating drawers that were historic map drawers and historic documents, files, and would take things of that significance out and begin separating them out from the regular working files. And the Henry Bosse photos are probably the best example of that of all.
Right. Where most of those were glass negatives, is that right? The originals?
There were about 8 glass negatives in Rock Island that they found. Most of them were destroyed, but there were about 5 albums, and each has a different set of images. So I don't know how much you want me to go into that, but it's a fascinating story of
Oh
discovering.
yeah, let's go there because like that is a big story, and there are a few places here and there. Well, there's one place I can think of where you can still see some of the photos easily in Winona at the Minnesota Marine Art Museum. But yeah, tell us a little bit about Henry Bosse.
So I was working at the Corps, and I received a call from a guy named Mike Connor in Washington, D.C. And Mike said, "Hey, I got these set of blue oval photographs, are 11 by 14. I have 169 of them in this album. It belonged to General Alexander Mackenzie, who was the Corps' Rock Island district engineer for about 16 years. when Bosse was there, and then went on to become the chief of engineers in Washington and took it to Washington with him when he left. They must have given him an album. And it said, views on the upper Mississippi taken under the direction of Alexander Mackenzie by Henry Bosse, Draftsman. And so Mike had taken it to a photographic show, his album. He had inherited it. And someone offered him 20,000 on the spot for it. So Mike wanted to know, are there more albums like this around? He wanted to know how valuable the album really was. And I said, I know we got these black and white images, but I've never seen the originals. And so Mike and I talked a few more times. He brought his to Swan Auction Galleries in New York. And Denise Bethel would go on to become the head of photography for Sotheby's, said the album ranked among the top 10 albums that she had ever seen in terms of photography, artistic photography. And so Mike would place his album with Sotheby's to be sold, and they valued it at 40 to 60,000. And Mike and I were talking, and he was describing in the frontispiece, this ornately sketched frontispiece, that there were some figures in the rock outcrop of the bluff. And so I had these padded photographs in padded albums, and then you open it up and it was like back-to-back photographs and vinyl sleeves. And so I pulled the image of the sketch out to look at it closer, and behind it was another photograph, a third photograph that had been hidden. And it said, views on the upper Mississippi, presented to U.S. Dredge William A. Thompson by Mrs. William A. Thompson. So I called the chief of maintenance and I said, there isn't an album of blue photographs on the Dredge Thompson, is there? It was the district's principal dredge boat. He said, yeah, it's in the pilot house. I said, well, it's worth a little bit of money. But the dredge was down by St. Louis. So when it got up to the Fountain City, Wisconsin boatyard, I went down and got it. I was worried it was going to have donut stains and grease stains and coffee stains all over it. But it was in immaculate condition. And Connor's album sold at Sotheby's for $66,000. And the guy who really bought the majority of it eventually called me up from San Francisco, an art dealer. He said, John, they didn't show that album very well. It's worth far more than $66,000. I can sell that album today for $650,000. It's going to be worth $1.5 million before I'm done with it. The album has now been valued by Sotheby's at $5 million.
Oh my goodness.
And Henry Bosse's photographs have gone on. So they broke up the album and sold at Sotheby's. The individual prints have gone all over the place now. Some to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, some to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. The National Museum in Washington did a special exhibit, the first 100 years of photography. Now they could choose anybody's photographs as their lead photograph on their webpage. They chose a Bosse. And then the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art did an exhibit on photography of the West, and they led with a Bosse image as well, called it out. So Bosse is regarded as one of the premier photographers in America of the 19th century.
So let's review quickly what he did. What was the time period when he was taking pictures? And at the time, he was just documenting the river for the Corps, if I remember right? He was an employee of the Corps?
Yeah, he was an employee of the Corps. He was a draftsman. He was mapping the river. He would produce the first detailed map of the Mississippi River, the first navigation charts, if you will. And so he's working on that project. And from 1883 to about 1893, he will take these photographs. And I think he combines photography with cartography. The detail of the maps is so amazing that it must have been informed by his understanding of the river photographically. And so they really overlap. He's filming the landscapes, the bridges, the communities. He's filming the Corps' work of the working boats on the river, the building of wing dams and shore protection. He's filming the raft boats, the lumber raft boats, the commerce on the river, wagon bridges and railroad bridges, which, the railroad bridges are the competition and their piers are obstacles. So he's doing it in such an artistic way that I had a lot of artists and people who know photography come and look at his album. And I had one of the producers of Ken Burns' Civil War series come and look at the album. And she said to me at one point, after we'd been going through it for a little while, there are 136 images in St. Paul's collection. She said, John, look at my arm. I've got goosebumps. We never saw anything of this quality in the Civil War series.
Wow. It's remarkable. So I know a lot of those pictures were reproduced in a book, and I'm blanking on the name now of who produced the book or who wrote the book. Do you remember?
There's two books. Charles Warenberg, the guy who bought many of the photographs from San Francisco, did his own book called Mississippi Blue. That's probably not the one you saw. There was one by Mark Newsel called, I think it's just named after Bosse's views on the Mississippi. Mark was a professor at St. Thomas University in St. Paul. I
Right,
think
who also wrote the history of canoes in North America.
exactly. Yeah, same
He-
Mark Newsel, Professor
You've been on
Newsel.
the podcast, so
Good, good,
yeah.
good.
And if people want, so I imagine you can go online and search for these and find digital images online of a lot of these pictures. To see them in person, like I know the Minnesota Marine Art Museum a few years ago, at least they had a display of some of the pictures. I don't know if those were a permanent display or just a temporary.
Those are reproductions. So they were among the first images shown in the museum, but they're reproductions. So they're long gone at this point. But the St. Paul district has his album in a safe deposit box right now. Um, Rock Island has a couple sets of images which are really unique and different. They have all kinds of treatments around them. They're not just simple ovals. The Dubuque Museum has a wonderful set of images in a couple albums. They have like 2 and 3 page foldouts, and every album has a different images in it, and no single album has all of them. And there's one other album that is at the Mayo Clinic Foundation in Rochester. It was given by the University of Minnesota Board of Regents to William Mayo upon his retirement from the board. The Mayos had a boat on the Mississippi and often traveled on it. So if you search the Mayo Clinic Foundation site, you'll find magazines they've done and videos they've done of the Bosse photographs, kind of in connection with the Mayo's experiences on the Mississippi.
Wow. So the Dubuque Museum you mentioned, that's the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium in Dubuque. And I don't remember where those photos would be. Are they out somewhere for the public to view in the museum, or do you have to go into the archives or?
No, I had to go to the archives and they took them out of the archives for me to
All right.
view and photograph.
All right. Yeah, that's the thing about having valuable photos like that. They're not necessarily out and most accessible for people who are just visiting a museum. You got to kind of know where they are and ask, I guess.
You do, and it's hard when it's an album because you can only show, if you want to show it, you can show one image at a time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, like he spent a good 10 years of his life pretty much every day or nearly every day out there next to the river, studying it and taking these pictures and drawing the maps. He probably at that point of time, there was probably nobody who knew that part of the river better.
Yeah, the obituaries about him talk about that he was the most knowledgeable person of the river's topography alive.
Hmm.
And we just after I retired, I followed up on a lead that I had and that I hadn't followed up on before because it didn't make sense. The attribution seemed all wrong. And so I started looking into it, and there was a reference to a guy named Schwatka who took the first winter expedition to Yellowstone in 1880s. And I looked into it deeper, and it mentioned that Schwatka hired Bosse to be the sketch artist to come with him. And the sketches are going to be published in the New York World and one of Joseph Pulitzer's magazines. So, and they also took one of the Yellowstone's most famous photographers to be the photographer. So they get to Yellowstone. Schwatka falls seriously ill, but they still do the photographs in Yellowstone. And there's pictures of Bosse in Yellowstone during this like a 50 below winter in Yellowstone. And there's some of the photos still there, but we don't know where Bosse's sketchbook is of Yellowstone.
Hmm. Wow. Maybe tucked away in the archive somewhere where somebody doesn't know quite what they have. Huh? How often
That's what I'm
that happens?
hoping. I'd love to find him at a used bookstore.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's a remarkable story. Probably we could do an entire episode of that. So I will post a link in the show notes to a place where people can look at some of the pictures online. I'm sure there must be something out there.
That'd be great. And then I do I've given probably 40 presentations on Bosse. including at Corps headquarters in Washington, to the head of Army Art, the two-star general head of Civil Works, and others. But on his tombstone in Davenport, it says, born on the estate of his grandfather, General Neithard von Gneisenau, Magdeburg, Prussia. The day before the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon has pushed the Prussians back. They're retreating. He turns on Wellington and the Dutch the next day and attacks. Gneisenau, along with Blücher, who's the head of the Prussians, rally the Prussians, bring them back to Waterloo and defeat Napoleon. So he grows up on the estate that his grandfather's given in reward, but he's a late son of one of the daughters, and he emigrates to America then because he's not in line to inherit. But he's trained in art engineering in Europe before he comes to America, and that art and engineering both come to play in his photographs and his mapping.
So he was an adult when he came to this country then.
Yeah, he was, I think, about 21 when he came.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
He started a card and stationery shop in Chicago.
Wow. That was his first job? Like that's what he did when he first came here?
Yeah, with a fellow German immigrant. And then he started working for the Harbor Improvement Office of the Corps in Chicago. Then shortly went to St. Paul, stayed there for a little bit, and then went to St. Paul District, and then went to Rock Island District.
Hmm. Yeah, there were some very big characters in our Rivers world over time, and he's definitely one of them. So I may have to think about a way we could do more about that. But I'll definitely post links though to where people can see some of the pictures because they are really dramatic. And it's a pre-lock and dam era photos, although the river was already being altered quite a bit with wing dams and some other structures.
This is, if you look at my book, The River We Have Wrought, it was done in stages on Corps projects. The locks and dams history piece of it came from that major rehabilitation project. My research into the history of the locks and dams informed that part of the book. The section of the book on wing dams and channel constriction in the early river was informed in my research into Bosse's work and his photographs. So every time I worked on a Corps project on the river, I would take a piece of it and start accumulating it into this bigger work.
Just like a good historian.
It's a cumulative process.
Well, let's move into that book a little bit then, because you began to work for the Park Service in 2000, and your book, "The River We Have Wrought," came out in 2003. What was your essential goal when you started writing that book, "The River We Have Wrought"?
I'd been attending a lot of meetings, and the Corps was getting beat up at these meetings. It was about the expansion of locks and dams, building longer locks and dams, 1,200-foot locks and dams. I think it might have been wrapped up in the lock and dam 26 redo of that lock and dam. And people were blaming the Corps for doing this to the river and that to the river. And it's like, as a historian, I knew that the Corps didn't do anything without Congress telling it to. And Congress didn't do anything without people telling it what they wanted. And so I started researching that and trying to look at why was the Corps doing what it was doing. And I found out, so the book is really a history of every major navigation project. Who pushed for it? What were their dreams and their hopes? What were their arguments? How did they convince Congress to authorize a project? How did they convince Congress to fund it? And so what I wanted to show people was that it wasn't the Corps doing this or doing that. It was the people doing this or that through the tools of Congress and the Corps. And I think it's an empowering story. What I wanted to tell people was, if you want to change the river into something you want today, look at what people did in the past to get what they wanted. Look at their movements, look at their tenacity, look at their passion. And I also incorporated a piece in that book then on the environment and the creation of the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. In chapter 7 of the book is really about the refuge creation. But that's another movement where someone said, we can have a different vision for this river, a different purpose, one for fish and wildlife and recreation. And Will Dilg and the Isaac Walton League did that 100 years ago this year. And so, again, it showed that it's not just navigation, but you can take a whole different perspective and push for it and make it happen.
Right. It was a remarkable period of time there in the 1920s when you had with these seemingly competing interests, the folks who wanted to preserve the river as it was and protect the natural environment, and then the folks who were pushing for major changes to make the river more reliably navigable for bigger boats.
Yeah, by 1917, there is no through commerce between Minneapolis and St. Louis. All the traffic, almost all of the traffic, it goes only about 10 miles between origin and destination, and it's all to build wing dams. It's rock and brush being hauled for wing dams. There's no commercial traffic. And so when Will Dilg and the guys at Walt League began this movement in 1922 and take the 24 to create the refuge, navigation's gone. It looks like they have the river to themselves. There's still wing dams under the 6-foot channel now, but navigation looks like it's fading away. So when the movement for the 9-foot channel really begins in 1925 and will grow up until 1930, it's going to challenge this view of what the river is going to be.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystem supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold. Well, there's so many directions to go with this, and I'm kind of curious. I mean, let's do this much at least. So, what were, based on your research, what were some of the primary reasons river navigation had essentially stopped by that point in time, by about 1910?
The inherent nature of nature, and because wing dams function, these rock and brush piers that stick into the river, they're piers of rock and brush. They narrow the river like the nozzle of a garden hose. The tighter you turn down the nozzle, the faster the water flows. And then it starts cutting through those sandbars by itself. Imagine sediment in the bottom of a glass. And then you start spinning the glass around. The sediment goes up into the column, right? And if you stop moving it, it drops back to the bottom. So what the wing dams did is they would sculpt out that sediment, get it moving up into the water column. It'd go between the wing dams, slow down and settle out. One engineer said it was not as much about narrowing the river as growing the banks. So they were growing the banks in to naturally narrow the river so it could scour itself. The problem is there was always someone at the spigot turning down the spigot. Nature in the fall, later part of the year, it's turning down the water. Well, you know what happens to your hose, even if you got it on the jet setting, if there's not enough water coming, it can't move that sediment. So it goes right back down into the riverbed. So even though the Corps had a 4.5 and then a 6-foot channel, they couldn't guarantee that depth in the fall. And when do farmers want to get out their products? In the fall. So they was just too unreliable. They would have to go to railroads, and railroads knew they had an advantage and took advantage of it. So there's two aspects to that. One is the actual inability of the river to ship the commerce, and two is railroads taking advantage of that. So navigation boosters would make both arguments. We need a navigable river to ship, and we need to compete with railroads.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. Well, and in retrospect, like, it's always easy to second guess this stuff, but at the time, I don't think anybody really thought this much about it. But it seems like the other alternative was whoever was. See, this was the 1930s, so FDR, or maybe who was it? Hoover or Coolidge was president before FDR. I should know my presidents better, but instead of taking on like this massive expense, an ongoing expense for the federal government, they could have just chosen to try to regulate the railroads and go after them from that perspective. But they didn't do that. They decided to just build this entire new system to compete with them.
Yeah, they tried that, regulating railroads in the late 19th century, when the 4.5-foot project would be authorized. And the Grangers movement, or the patrons of husbandry, mushroomed into this massive farmer movement across America and became politically very powerful. And they got some things passed called the Granger laws, which were to regulate railroads, but the Supreme Court overturned the laws. And so they tried that route. And so when they realized they politically and legally they weren't going to win, they went to navigation as the alternative. Roosevelt could have tried it again, or Hoover was in office right before him, but they just had tried that in the past, in the memorable past for those people, and it had failed.
Right.
And there's also, I mean, some people think that the locks and dams were just a New Deal make-work project, and what I tell them is no, it wasn't. That project was teed up to pass Congress in 1930 when the Depression hit. They've been working on it for 5 years. So there were already locks and dams on the Ohio. So it wasn't like it was something new we were going to do in America. It was already baked, but it didn't hurt to make it a make-work project. So it got it done faster than it would have otherwise.
Right. Right. Maybe it was a tipping point. Maybe it's one of those things that would have languished even longer, and then until there was no chance it was going to happen if conditions had changed. But the depression and the need to put people to work kind of gave it that extra push to get it through Congress. And there was a lot of opposition for a while, as I recall. So,
of course, was the biggest opponents of it.
yeah, right.
So,
Well, we could go on about this for quite a
yes.
while, and maybe I would love to do a deep dive into this someday. But you've had such an interesting career. I want to make sure we have time to get on to the second part, because you've worked for the federal government for a lot, but kind of the first part of your career, you were working for the Corps and really supporting navigation and its commercial interests, and then you switched to the National Park Service, where you're working with the public and recreation. So tell me a little bit about that switch, like how you got to work for the National Park Service.
It was because of my work with the Corps, because every project I worked on for the Corps, I mean, I could have been maybe a typical government employee. I could have done my piece for it, done that background for the National Register, did it was it qualified or not, and then moved to the next thing. But every time I did something, I found it so fascinating. I would do a presentation on it. And then I'd get asked to do the presentation around, or write an article for a journal on it. I just had that academic background that I wanted to keep going, even if I wasn't in academia. And so I kept writing and publishing and speaking. And the Park Service didn't have a historian. The Mississippi National River and Recreation Area is established in 1988. It's just getting going into the 1990s. And so by the late 90s, they're coming to me a lot to do presentations, to understand the history of the river. And I'm always helping them out. And I think finally they said, we should just get John over here and create a position for him. And the other book that I wrote, in part with some other authors and edited, but I wrote most of it, was River of History, which is a history of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area stretch of the river, 72 miles through the Twin Cities. And if you look at the cover of that book, which is available online from the park, it's got both the Corps of Engineers castle on it and the National Park Service arrowhead. I wrote that jointly while I was with both. And then the Park Service finally created this position that I applied for and got, so I could start their history program and cultural resources program in 2000.
Wow. I don't know if people outside of Minnesota understand how this recreation area that was created and how unique this is. So tell us a little bit about, so it's 72 miles through the Twin Cities, basically from the suburban north reaches, following the river down to the southeast. How did we end up with this national recreation area in the middle of this urban area?
I was trying to figure out how to summarize that question into something fairly simple. So let me just say, I'll see how quickly I can do this for you. The late 1960s, this guy gets this idea, this developer. He's going to build two 24-story tall condominiums at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, down in the floodplain. They will look down on historic Fort Snelling. You'll be able to look down on the international airport. They'll loom over the whole river valley because they're going to come right out of it. And he starts working on it in the early 1970s. But the 1970s, as the environmental movement is taking off, it's already taken off in the late 60s. It's mushrooming in the early 1970s. And so people started protesting against this. The Minnesota Historical Society said this is going to ruin the viewshed from historic Fort Snelling. The Metropolitan Council, which has a lot of missions within the Twin Cities metro area, opposed floodplain development and supported protecting the site for recreation. It was a parkland. It would become parkland. But in 1973, the developer drove 800 steel pilings 90 feet down into the sand and was going to begin developing this project. In the same year, Governor Wendell Anderson then signed the Minnesota Critical Areas Act, and it allowed the governor to designate areas in Minnesota that were of critical environmental or historic significance for protection under gubernatorial executive orders. And so 1973 to 74, the Citizens League of St. Paul really gets a deep interest in preserving and protecting the metro riverfront. And they and others will then start pushing on the governor's office to designate 72 miles of the Mississippi through the Twin Cities a critical area. And so in 1976, Governor Anderson creates the Mississippi River Corridor Critical Area. And so now we have 72 miles of the Mississippi, 54,000 acres within its boundaries, protected by gubernatorial executive orders. 1979, but it had to be renewed. And then in 1979, Republican Governor Albert Quay renews it. And then in 1980, the Met Council will make it permanent. And so 1980, we have a permanent critical area protection. But the promoters wanted more. They wanted more protection. They wanted national park status for this. And Peter Gove was a significant player in it. He was at age 26 or 7, he became the first Minnesota Pollution Control Agency commissioner, gubernatorial office at 26 or 7.
Wow.
He would go on to work in the National Park Service office in Washington as the liaison to the Capitol for the National Park Service to Congress. And so he knew the mechanisms to get things moving for the National Park Service designation. And he'd be one of the key factors behind this. He worked with Bruce Vento in DC. And he knew Dave Durnberger very well, Republican senator. So between Peter Gove, Bruce Vento, Democratic congressman, Republican senator, they proposed this idea for a national river and recreation area. And in 1988, Congress established it. And they got that. But since there was already this critical area, they made the national park footprint exactly the same as the Mississippi River critical area. So the big change came in. The governor's executive orders weren't very strong. Communities along the river just there's 21 cities and towns and 4 townships within the 72 miles, 5 congressional districts. It's a very complex area. But Friends of the Mississippi River and others then started pushing to get the executive orders made rules. And that almost cost us the designation altogether. But they came back, and in 2017, the state established rules. So every city in the corridor has to put in their plans these rules and address them. They have to adopt the rules.
Wow. Well, so tell us a little bit about the practical side of this then, because this is in this 72-mile corridor, the Park Service actually doesn't own very much land.
It's about 64 acres out of the 54,000.
Right. So what does the Park Service do with that corridor then? What is their influence? What are they actually doing with that?
Well, it's one of the things is that the park really has 3 missions. Congress gave it 3 missions in the authorizing legislation: protect, preserve, and enhance the significant values of the Mississippi River corridor through the Twin Cities, through that 72 miles, encourage the coordination of federal, state, and local programs. And then one I love the most is ensure orderly development along the river. So how do you do that? Well, the governor's executive order, but then the rules really help us try, do good development along the river. But we don't have federal laws and regulations except where there's federal land or federal money involved. So we have to rely on the local communities and the Department of Natural Resources to do things. So everything is about partnership. Every success, all the interpretation, education the park does of the river, all the development project reviews really depend on partnerships and pushing people to do the right thing for the Mississippi. It is the National Park Service unit whose mission and focus is the Mississippi River. There's Jazz and John Lafitte in New Orleans. There's the Arch in St. Louis, where you are. There's effigy mounds. There's trails across the river. But this is the only one whose mission is the Mississippi River. So it is the Mississippi River's National Park in essence.
Right. So during the course of those 20 some years when you worked for the recreation area, then how much change did you see in the way the public engaged with the Mississippi?
It was the most frustrating thing in the world. I could walk out of my building, downtown St. Paul, in uniform, my National Park Service hat on, and someone would stop me and say, "You work for the DNR? Are you a sheriff? Do you work for law enforcement?" I say, No, I'm a National Park Ranger. So what state park do you work for? I said, No, I point to the arrowhead on my shoulder. I said, I'm with the National Park Service. So what are you doing here? And then I'd have to explain to them that there was a national park here because people just didn't know. And so that was the number one problem when I was superintendent and working for the park, and it still is, getting people to know the park exists and that the river corridor is a national park unit. And so that was one of the things we would work hardest on. And so the predecessor to me, the superintendent before me, Paul Lavovitz, had this bold idea. When he came in, he said, I'm going to put 10,000 kids on this river every year. And people laughed at him. We only had like 2 canoes in the office. And by the time he left, he had started something called the Urbanist Wilderness Canoe Adventures Program and was putting 10,000 kids, middle school, high school kids, on the river a year in the metro area in Voyager canoes. And so it really, so if you can start getting these kids learning about the river, they'll tell their parents about it, and it starts growing it. And then my philanthropic partner, that's when I was with the Park Service, my philanthropic partner, the Mississippi Park Connection, they got this bold idea that instead of doing a bike share program, why don't we do a kayak share program? So they developed this program called Paddle Share. So you can go to this locker in different parts of the river, get a code online, pay for it online. It costs maybe about $25, $30 for a couple hours. And you can key in a code. You can get a life jacket, a paddle, and a kayak. You canoe downriver, kayak downriver with it. You come to your stop, and then you deposit the kayak on a rack and put the life jackets inside a bin. And then you can either take a bike share bike back, or call an Uber or a Lyft, or have a friend take you back to where you started. So it's been a very popular program within the Twin Cities. So we're trying to get people on the river to experience it.
I think that was the first place where a paddle share program like that was tried. Is that right?
It is. It actually became, we had people calling us from Florida and Germany and other places about the program.
And I know a few others have popped up here and there. I think there's one in Quincy, Illinois, in the Bay, if I remember right. I should probably look that up before I just talk off the top of my head. But I know there's been a lot of interest in trying to replicate that in different parts along the river, including here at St. Louis. And that may happen here in the next couple of years. But it's an inspiring program. And I think a lot of people were probably very skeptical that something like that would work. But it's been a big success.
It's been a great success in terms of getting people on. It has been underwritten by funds, philanthropic funds and other funds. It's hard to make it go financially. So they're still working on that piece of it to make it a really profitable endeavor. They might have done that since I left. I'm not positive.
All right. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I know that part of the river, it seems like there's a lot of recreation now. I don't know, maybe 20 years ago that wasn't the case, but I was just up in Minneapolis last week, and on my way out of town, I caught in the distance, I saw a group of like 5 or 6 kayakers on the Mississippi. I forget exactly where that was in the gorge, but it was somewhere along the gorge. This is late, October, and of course it's unusually warm for October. But even that late in the year, there were people out there trying to get, the last paddle maybe they can get in before the river starts to get too cold and freeze up. But there's a lot of recreation along there. There are private groups that take people out on paddle trips.
Yeah, so I often ask people on tours I do here this question: how many Mississippis are there in the Twin Cities? And of course, people look at me weirdly. And they'll say the St. Croix and the Minnesota. And I say, no, how many Mississippis are there? And then they really look puzzled. And I'll tell them there's three distinct rivers in the 72 miles of the metro area within the national park unit. The river enters the northern metro as a prairie river. There's banks, not bluffs. There's islands. There's not huge. There's some backwaters. You never see anybody sandbagging above Minneapolis on the Prairie River. Then at St. Anthony Falls, downtown Minneapolis, the river drops into what we call the gorge, which you've referenced. From St. Anthony Falls, 8.5 miles downriver to the confluence with the Minnesota River, the Mississippi drops 110 feet. It's the steepest drop anywhere on the whole river through the tightest, narrowest canyon. The bluffs are a quarter to a third of a mile apart, 80 to 100 feet high. The river drops 110 feet. So dramatic drop. You get to the mouth of the Minnesota River and you enter the big Mississippi, the large floodplain river, the river of image, myth, and metaphor, the river of Mark Twain really begins there at the confluence. So, and then you see the big river, this, big backwaters, high bluffs, braided channels, a lot more locks and dams. So there's three very different rivers, and the development along each, the recreation is different along each. Nowhere in the entire Mississippi does it change so much over such a short distance.
Hmm. Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. And you're right. You said there's different kinds of recreation in each stretch. So
Kayaks, canoes, in the gorge and above, up in the Prairie River, big boats like you see down in St. Louis, recreational boats, big marinas all along that large floodplain river.
yeah, absolutely. I hope people in the Twin Cities appreciate how special that part of the river is. I'm envious every time I go up in that area. 'Cause, in St. Louis, we do have some recreational boating north of St. Louis, closer to Alton in that area, but we're so industrial down here. There's very little recreation directly, that touches the city of St. Louis where I live. So I get a little envious at times when I go up to the Twin Cities, at least when it's warm, and see how easy it is and how accessible the river is up there.
Yeah, it's spectacular. I was just north of St. Louis. I can't remember how quite far I was on an American Cruise Lines trip as a speaker, and it was like a holiday weekend, and I saw 54 boats pulled up to a beach. 50,
Wow.
an armada. I've never seen that many, 54 boats pulled up along a beach. That's unbelievable recreation on the river.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the other changes across time is that indigenous communities, indigenous people have a much greater voice in how we manage the river in the natural world now. Can you talk a little bit about, like, from the Park Service perspective, from the recreation areas perspective, how your relationship with indigenous communities changed over time, and how that affected the way you think about managing the park?
So my doctoral degree was in American Indian history. I studied the Mandan and the Missouri River. And so when I went to the Corps, I became tribal coordinator, working with tribes through multiple states. One of my biggest successes was the Lafarge, Wisconsin project. It was going to be a big dam at Lafarge, Wisconsin, flood protection dam. They built the dam, they built the control tower, they bought out all the farmers, 8,700 acres, and then the National Environmental Policy Act passed in 1969. And so they tried to revive it, they couldn't. So finally, Congress passed an act saying that 1,200 acres of this land is going to go to the Ho-Chunk Indians in Wisconsin. The rest is going to go to the Kickapoo Reserve Management Board for ecotourism. And so I ended up becoming the Corps' major negotiator, really, in person on the project. Attended 26 meetings over a year-long period. We had 1 year to complete it, and we did it. And so it was a spectacular success, and it took what was going to be a big reservoir, flood control reservoir, and made it into a reserve, and it gave the Ho-Chunk the biggest piece of land they had. They had like 96 acres before that, and there was over 700 archaeological sites in that valley. So they chose the lands they wanted. So that was one of my roles as tribal coordinator, was to help with those things like that with the Corps. And so I continued that role when I went to the Park Service. So tribal coordination was a big part of what I did. And there's, if you look at today, how much, when I first started, we were coordinating with multiple tribes, the Dakota, of course, in Minnesota, the Ojibwa within Minnesota. There's 4 federally recognized Dakota tribes, 9 Ojibwa tribes. But we'd also coordinate with tribes outside of the park. At one time, we coordinated with 50 some tribes on a project at Coldwater Spring, a new property we'd acquired. But I think, today, and what happened was, it was like formal consultation, tribes would reply, but it was more disengaged, it seems like. It transitioned over the last decade to where tribes are far more engaged in wanting a voice in what happens in the metro region. It harkens back to those days of the American Indian movement that you mentioned. Not that radical in sense, but is deliberative in wanting a absolute voice in how we do things in the Twin Cities. And there's 2 places where that's really happening. In 2014, Congress passed an act directing the Corps to close the Upper St. Anthony Falls lock in 2015. And so the Corps is leaving that lock. All the navigation that went through that lock had to go through the one right below it, Lower St. Anthony Lock and Dam, and Lock and Dam 1 downstream in the gorge. So the Corps wants to close all 3 right now. At the upper lock, the Park Service initially took over interpretation education there, but now there's a Dakota-led group that's come in that wants to repurpose the lock as a Dakota Indian site. They're called Owamni Yamni Okadahade. I guess it's hard to say that last one. Okadeape is their name. And Owamni Yamni is the St. Anthony Falls, the Dakota word for St. Anthony Falls. And so they've really taken over envisioning the future of what that lock is going to become, making it more natural, making it a place for people in the metro area to come and hear a Dakota story of which was a very sacred site to them, St. Anthony Falls. The other site is the Bruce Venter Nature Sanctuary just below downtown St. Paul. And there's another Dakota-led organization that is taking on the redo of that parkland. There was a cave there called Carver's Cave or Wakan Tipi. Jonathan Carver was an English colonist who visited that area in 1766. And he described this cave and about the petroglyphs carved over the top of it and very detailed in his book. And so it became part of a big railroad yard. But then before I left the Corps, we had the chance to change that into, in the early years with the Park Service, change that into parkland with the Department of Natural Resources and others in the Lower Phelan Creek project. So it was remade, part of it, into this nature area in honor of Bruce Vento. But because of that sacred site there, that cave, and right above the cave is Mounds Park, which is, it's got burials going back 2,000 years almost on above the cave. And so it's a very, very significant indigenous site. So that site has also been, the lead now for that is the Dakota-led group. And so they're helping define it. They've got significant money from the Minnesota legislature to build a new interpretive center there. And that's under construction, I believe. So it's far bigger presence, far bigger voice has come back.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable change in a fairly short period of time. It feels like, and it's attracted some attention too. On the BBC website, I think a couple of weeks ago, there was a lengthy article about how Minneapolis had kind of become this epicenter of a resurging indigenous autonomy and cultural renaissance. And if folks, maybe I'll see if I can find that and post a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great. That would be
That was
great.
a really good overview because, there's so many different little areas where it's happening, like the restaurant, Sean Sherman's restaurant.
Yeah.
Also, it was mentioned in that article, and it's also located very close to St. Anthony Falls in the river.
It's right there at St. Anthony Falls. You can have a great view of the falls if you go eat there.
Owamni, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have been, one of these lucky people to spend, lucky from my perspective, to have spent so much of your life and career working on the Mississippi. What are a couple of the lessons that you have learned about our relationship with the river during all those years of your experience?
I would say the biggest lesson is that if you want to change the river and want a different future for it, you got to take action. Every single thing that has happened to this river, every lock and dam, every levee, every refuge has happened because a dedicated group of people wanted to make it happen, and they did. And that's, like I said, it's a really empowering concept that we're going to have a conversation about the future of the locks and dams right here in the heart of the Twin Cities. It's already started. The Corps has said, imagine there's a for sale sign on these locks and dams. We want to get rid of them. So what are we going to do with the locks and dams right in the heart of the Twin Cities? Two of them, Lower St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam 1. Upper, you can't get rid of the dam because St. Anthony Falls would go away. And the Dakota are planning out what's going to happen with the lock itself. But so the other two locks and dams where there's going to be a significant indigenous voice as well of what happens to the river. And there's coordination going on that for that right now. But do we leave them in and have two reservoirs? We have a land of over 14,000 lakes. These are like lakes. You could take out those two locks and dams and restore the natural rapids of the gorge at 100. It'd be about a 64-foot drop from below St. Anthony Falls to the Minnesota River. This phenomenal rapids would come back, and with it, the rock and gravel and boulder strata at the bottom was a spawning bed for all kinds of fish. When Jonathan Carver, that English colonist, reached St. Anthony Falls in 1766, he said there are all kinds of eagles' nests at St. Anthony Falls because of all the fish trying to migrate above it. It was the head of fish migration in the whole river. And so, we could have that back. And so what I'm telling people is the question before us is locks and dams are the concrete and steel embodiment of past visions, past passion for the river. Are those our visions? Are those our passions for a 21st century relationship to the Mississippi? Or do we have a different vision? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity here to do something new and different and restore a really critical piece of the Mississippi River. If we could restore the gorge and the fishery of it in that spawning beds, it could impact the fishery for 100 miles or more downstream and up various tributaries. So it's that passion, it's that drive, it's that determination to create a river we want in the 21st century. It can be done because people in the past have done it. That's my biggest lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. What are there particular challenges that worry you the most about the river's future over the next 50 to plus years? Or
I was thinking about that, and I can talk about invasive carp, agricultural sediment, runoff, nitrogen, phosphorus, climate change. I mean, those are the big three I see for the upper Mississippi anyway. But I think the bigger problem is, if not apathy, just not knowing and being distracted by too many things now. There's too many things coming at us, too much distraction. The biggest part is getting people to know there's even a problem that we need to address. That's the hardest thing. And so podcasts like yours are one of those mediums that can help educate people. There is this river out here. It's one of the greatest rivers in the world. It's a phenomenal, world famous, worldwide significant ecological system that we need to be aware of. And it's more than ecological system. I mean, it's a water supply, it's navigation, it's recreation, it's all these things. How do we balance those in the best way that demonstrates the 21st century relationship?
right, and we have as you said, we can advocate for a different balance in different ways that we balance all those different needs. We're not bound by what people decided 100 years ago.
No, we have to. Every generation has to hit the reset button and say, is this the world I want? Or do I have something better in mind? Because we've changed who we are as people. You got to ask the questions that like this chance in the locks and dams in the Twin Cities, whether the locks stay in and dams stay in or come out. I want at the end of the process to know we made the best decision for this river at this time in history.
Amen. Well, John, we're probably pushing the limits of time here too. So this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. If people want to know more about you or follow your work, what would be the best way to do that?
People have said, John, you should get a website. John, you should, have a podcast. And I haven't done any of that. I've been I've been involved in so many things, river things, since I retired. People say I'm busier than I was when I was superintendent. I just tell them I'm just pursuing my passion now. I'm back to being a river environmental historian on the river and on multiple boards and commissions and doing what I can to make people aware of this river and its importance. So I don't have those websites, but I'm certainly available if you search me on the internet, and I'm happy to talk to people anytime.
Well, John, thank you very much. I appreciate the conversation today.
Dean, it's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.